Welcome back to this workshop, which is organized by the Collective for the Political Determinants of Health. For those of you who are just joining us online, my name is Katarina Storang, and I co-direct the collective with Sakiko Fukudapar, and we're coming at you here from Oslo, the University of Oslo. We're now going to move on to our first session presenting new research from collective members, which is about rethinking accountability and power hierarchies and understanding global health. And this is, of course, a hybrid workshop, and I just want to remind you in the audience online that we welcome participation also from those participating via Zoom. You can use the raise hand function, in which case you may be asked to turn on your camera and sound in order to ask your question through video, or if you prefer not to be seen, you can ask your question in writing in the Q&A, but it would be nice if you identify yourself when doing so. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our chair for this session, Remco van den Pas. He is a public health doctor and a research fellow at the Center for Planetary Health Policy, which is a think tank in Berlin, and is also a lecturer at the Institute for Tropical Medicine in Antwerp. And he is a member of our collective for political determinants of health, whose research and teaching really focus on global health governance, broadly construed, its political economy and foreign policy, with specific attention to health workforce development and migration, and also to health system strengthening, and more recently also the ecological determinants of health. So Remco, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Katerini. It's really a pleasure to be here in this setting and to be part of this conference, and specifically to talk really about more in detail about accountability, power hierarchies, democratization, and how we see this. We have an excellent set of speakers, but the way I understood the session for today was that we have seen a mushrooming and diversification of multi-stakeholder initiatives and actors in global health over the years, including intersectoral networks, fora, institutionalization, fragmentation, independent committees, like the Lancet one and others, financial mechanisms and more. It accelerated during and in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's a trend much visible that was from before as well. And these current developments go much further than the traditional public-private partnership models, and they may include goals that extend beyond global health and its impact itself, and include actors such as financial investors, insurance companies, who were traditionally not active in the global health domain. And as an example, like what I read yesterday, we can see, for instance, the regionalized vaccine manufacturing collaborative that was launched at the World Economic Forum. Who are they? What kind of actors are involved in that? In such initiatives. So there remains pertinent questions to be asked on the governance, democratic legitimacy and politics of these approaches. Regarding more recent developments post-pandemic, and also perhaps a kind of theory built around it. Now, I would like to hear more about this from the speakers and the audience in the coming session, which takes an hour and a half. I will introduce our speakers that are with us now. I start with Dave McCoy. Dave, wonderful that you're here. Dave is working at the University International Institute for Global Health in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He's a public health specialist, former professor of global public health, who works in the field of health systems, policy and development, global health governance, and international health policy. Long experience working now also on the political and economic determinants of health. And Dave has been working across and in civil society, the National Health Services in the UK and academia. David, wonderful that you're here. You will talk about the power and accountability of the private sector. Secondly, Jashodhara Dasgupta, an independent researcher, an independent feminist researcher with over 30 years experience in gender rights and health, working on rural women's and girls' leadership in rights claiming, co-founded 4 feminist organizations in India, as well as headed one of them, Sahayog, for 12 years, and extensively engaged with civil society campaigns nationally and internationally on the right to health, the right to food security, and women's economic rights. And she has received several fellowships as well as published widely on gender rights and health. And she was also a member of the Lancet University of Oslo Commission from 10 years ago. Last but not least, Jashodhara will speak about Beyond the Binary, Interrogating Authenticity in Decolonizing Discourses. Welcome, Jashodhara, also here. Lastly, Desmond McNeill, here from Oslo, a development economist, academic, has been working on the link between academic research and policy making. He was a director of the Center for Development and Environment here in Oslo at SUM. From 2001 to 2018, he was the head of research there, and having worked quite a lot on food systems, global health governance, but really from a development economic perspective. He was the director of the independent panel on global governance, as we have seen in the first session, and he is also a member of the high-level panel of experts on sustainable food systems. And Desmond will speak about the World Economic Forum and global governance and stakeholder capitalism. Welcome, Desmond. Let's start. The speakers have 50 minutes each. We will note them when they have 2 minutes to go. But I really would like to invite David to kick off this session. David, the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Remco. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel alongside Desmond and Jashodhara, and also to be reconnected with so many people who've been part of this Lancet Oslo Commission and some of the surrounding debates about the report that was published 10 years ago. Now, my talk is going to be on power and accountability of the private sector, but more specifically on the power and accountability of powerful private actors. I'm not going to be speaking about the private sector in general terms. And the first thing that I'd like to do, if I can change my slide, is to actually initiate a campaign for a new acronym, because we don't have enough acronyms in global health. So I'd like to welcome you all to PPA, Powerful Private Actors, an acronym that I'm going to be using in this talk. Although I am still rather partial towards two potential alternatives, EPPA and possibly UPPA. So please let me know if you think either of these two alternatives will catch on quicker than just simple PPA. Now, the reason for focusing on PPAs should be clear and evident to everyone in this room. We have a huge amount of hyper-concentrated wealth and market power everywhere. We use the terms big pharma, big tech, big agro, big data, big oil, big media as collective nouns for the mega corporations that now dominate and monopolize just about any market or economic sector that one can think of. There's $20 trillion worth of private assets managed by only 3 index funds, reflecting not just an eye-watering hyper-concentration of financial power, but also the scale of the force that is driving financialization in every aspect of our life right across the world, affecting the planet, eroding public services and institutions, and commercializing our social and cultural lives. The same pattern of concentrated power can be seen in the non-profit sector, with an over-concentration of influence amongst a handful of corporatized international NGOs and hyper-concentration of influence amongst a handful of private foundations. Now, thanks to the work of Oxfam and others, we've been able to track also the growing concentration of wealth amongst individuals. And I'm sure all of you have seen some of the awful and eye-watering statistics about how much wealth is owned by the elite. But the latest report warns us that we can expect the world's first trillionaire within 10 years if current trends persist. Now, this year, Oxfam's report carried two forwards. One written by Bernie Sanders from the USA, and the other by Ruqaiya Rafiq, who leads a non-profit women-headed organization in Bangladesh concerned with women's rights. And I've picked out two quotes from each of their forwards. Firstly, Bernie Sanders writes in his forward, "Never before in human history have so few owned so much. Never before in human history has there been such income and wealth inequality. Never before in history have we had such huge concentrations of ownership. Never before in history have we seen a billionaire class with so much political power. And never before have we seen this unprecedented level of greed, arrogance, and irresponsibility on the part of the ruling class." Ruqaiya Rafiq, from her forward, says that this Oxfam report has shown me more than ever how the power of these huge corporations and their billionaire owners grows seemingly ever stronger, and that we can never have an equal world until we confront that power and overcome it. And it seems to me hard to understand how anyone working in global health would not share the same concerns and anger as both Bernie Sanders and Ruqaiya Rafiq, especially after what we witnessed with COVID. Now, what's, I think, also implicit in this Bernie Sanders quote is that the Oxfam reports are not just about inequality, but they're also about misrule and the capture of governments and governance by powerful private actors, and how this prevents appropriate political and policy responses to the multiple crises that are facing the world today. It's also about plutocracy and oligarchy. It's about the erosion, not just of democracy, but also of the democratic institutions and cultures, our democratic ways of thinking and behaving, and about the democratic principles of freedom, liberty, and dignity for all. And I would say it's also about contemporary and globalized forms of colonialism exercised through a financialized and corporatized political economy. Now, if we accept that excessive private power is undermining good governance and damaging society and the planet, it follows that we have to join Ruqaiya's call to confront and overcome the problem of excessively concentrated and I think also abusive power. So let's unpack that a little bit more. First, do we confront power in global health? And if we do, what does that confrontation consist of? I think we can say that we have confronted power as an academic and scientific issue. There are numerous studies, papers, and reports about power in global health, including the Commission on Social Determinants for Health's report in 2008, and also the Lancet Oslo Commission's report, in which the word power was mentioned 100 times. When it comes to studying powerful private actors, there is some academic research and important monitoring and evaluation done by some NGOs and civil society groups. But on the whole, I would say political economy research and studies of the political determinants of health are neglected in the broader field of global health. So we have neglected tropical diseases, but I would say that we also have, more importantly, a whole bunch of neglected social diseases. But the more important question is not have we confronted the idea of power, but have we actually confronted those actors with excessive power and who abuse that power in global health? I mean, we certainly describe and complain about the harmful effects of commercial and corporate activity. And I think there are many of us who speak truth to power, as the old adage goes. But the question is that confrontational enough? Now, some years ago, I had the opportunity to chat with the former war correspondent, someone called Greg McLaughlin, who wrote this book. And one thing really stayed in my mind that he said to me which was that in his experience of being a war correspondent, power already knows the truth, and that speaking to power achieved little, if anything. And I made a mental note that day to never use the phrase speak to power ever again. Instead, what I now say is that we must speak the truth about power. And of course, the relevance and importance of this is that one of the things that powerful actors do, whether they're public or private, is to conceal or distort any form of truth that may be damaging or even inconvenient to them. Sometimes this is done overtly through censorship and force, or through deliberate misinformation, but often it's done through creating the conditions for self-censorship, or by capturing and co-opting those whose job it is to study, assess, inform, and educate, including journalists, scientists, academics, think tanks, NGOs, and professional bodies. And here, I think we have a problem in global health. The growing dependence and reliance upon private funding and investment has meant a growing level of self-censorship when it comes to challenging the private sector, and it has led inevitably to higher degrees of capture. But what about overcoming excessive and abusive power? Never mind confronting it. How are we doing here? Well, there's a litany of ready-made and obvious policy prescriptions for how we overcome the concentration of power. Use of antitrust legislation and competition policy to break up monopolies, or bringing back natural monopolies into public ownership and control. Implementing effective and fair tax policies and systems to redistribute wealth. Regulating banks and accountancy rules to prevent the corrosive effects of corruption and tax avoidance. And anyone who's read Tim Schwab's recent book about the Gates Foundation would, whether you agree with this analysis or not, probably accept the argument that there is also a need for regulation of private foundations. Now, presently, I would say that we don't do enough to speak up about these kinds of policy recommendations, let alone campaign for them. Presently, the global health system is dominated by actors with ideas and narratives that focus on downstream problems and solutions, and not on the upstream problems and solutions. We focus on the low-hanging fruit, and not enough on the fruit higher up the tree. Moreover, the resulting focus of biomedical and technological solutions at the expense of social and political solutions also often has the effect of reinforcing power symmetries and enabling even more wealth concentration, as we saw with COVID. And here we should look not only at the massive extraction of wealth and profits from the health and social care sectors around the world by corporations and private financial institutions, but also at how excessively wealthy individuals are getting even more wealthy through philanthropy. So there are parts of the global health system that I think are actually contributing to the deeper problems of social inequalities, and in some ways also acting as an alibi for actors who are pushing us further and further down the road towards plutocracy and oligarchy. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as global health professionals is whether it is best to only do what we can within the space allowed us by the powerful private actors that are now so dominant and influential, and by the institutions of governance that they now heavily shape and influence, or whether we have to challenge and overcome the borders and constraints of that space. Now, these are questions that we are discussing internally at the United Nations University International Institute of Global Health and with our various partners as part of our new 5-year strategic plan, which I only launched about a week ago. I thought it'd be useful to end by describing that 5-year plan and to invite all of you to work with us in delivering it. The strategic plan consists of 4 work packages, one on gender equality and intersectionality, the second on power and accountability, third on digital health governance, the fourth climate justice.
And 2 minutes left.
Each of these themes and topics through 5 lenses: intersectionality, feminism, decoloniality, contextualization, and examining the role of private actors, and engaging in a range of activities, as you can see here at the bottom, what we describe as tactics in the strategic plan. So allow me now to conclude and hand back to Remco, and look very much forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a very good entry point to the debate and how to take this forward, also how to collaborate within the UN system and like your own institution, but also recognizing perhaps the limits and how we address those power hierarchies within our own work. We'll continue with the presentations and have a discussion afterwards and a question and answer. And I invite the audience really to think already how they would like to engage with the speakers. But I give it over to Jashodhara. Please.
Thank you very much, Remco. And I'll try and share my screen if I can. Yeah. Right. Is it visible? Can you see the screen? Remco?
Yes, we
can see it.
Okay, right. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm really sort of privileged to be discussing this with you here today regarding the political determinants of health, given the kind of political almost conflagration that we are seeing in one part of the world, and the innocent people who are at the facing end of it. So I've already shared the title, which is about interrogating authenticity and going beyond the binary in decolonizing discourses. So what I hope to discuss today is really looking at some of the hierarchies that are visible from a colonial perspective in global health. And I will limit myself to knowledge production, and also try and put out some ideas on how we can rethink accountability in decolonizing global health knowledge production. I'd like to close with something to complicate the conversation a bit, which is to look beyond the binary. So the first idea that I'd like to put out here is about the coloniality that is inherent within global health knowledge production. Scholars have talked about coloniality as something that continues beyond the act of political decolonization. And Quijano and Nodlovu-Gatsheni have talked about hierarchies and patterns of power that impact almost every dimension of life, and which have definitely an epistemological impact and about the process of knowledge production. When I talk about global health knowledge production, I'm really thinking about some of these actors. And I agree with what David has just pointed out about the private sector and philanthropies as being very central today to the whole management of global health knowledge production. But of course, there are also the global health public-private partnerships that are multiplying by the day and looking at various health conditions. And the others, of course, are the usual suspects, the UN and other multilateral forums, academic publishing, research, conferences and commissions like ours, and of course, the whole process of creating the workforce that carries forward the global health agenda. So what are the visible power hierarchies that scholars have identified? One of the things which I think was flagged in the earlier panel conversation was how problems were always seen as elsewhere. And the way that they are solved is usually from a fly-in, fly-out perspective, in which there is actually a lack of accountability to the local communities whose problems ostensibly are being solved. So very little consultation, very little feedback, and there is a concentration of data, resources, and of course, expertise within the high-income country institutions, because Western standards really are universal. And whatever else is seen as local, therefore, is undervalued. And we also found in the COVID kind of global standard setting that there were so many pronouncements of how to safeguard oneself, which are completely unrealistic in the settings where hundreds of millions of people live in low and middle income countries and who are impacted by various other structural determinants. So there is overall a failure to recognize or to surface some of the very deep-seated racial, sociopolitical, and financial inequities. And I think David has already talked about this just before me. So in academia, we find that there is a concentration in the high-income countries where low-income country researchers have to go in order to be educated to their standards and receive the skills that make them suitable workers. And they, in turn, receive projects which are channeled through those institutions in order to carry out research in their low-income countries. Much has been written by Shea, Abimbola, and others about academic publishing and the kind of voice that is privileged, especially the one that promotes, meta-knowledge and disregards the more local and more nuanced exploration. And the fact that whatever is worthwhile knowledge has to be in the literature. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with how dominant neoliberal frameworks have corporatized and commercialized the process of knowledge production, and how scholars in the global south are always confronted by paywalls if they're not part of the marketplace of the university. Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just got lost here. Yeah. So how do we rethink accountability if we want to decolonize the discourses within global health knowledge production? So I think there are certain boxes that have been ticked in the last few years, for example, in the 10 years since the Lancet Commission on Global Governance for Health. So more diversity, more equity and inclusion, looking at more research funding, more training scholarships, peer-reviewed publications now have editors from the Global South, and authorship is granted for research findings. Perhaps another box to tick would be consultations, participation, local dissemination, but would any of these fundamentally change the power asymmetries and lead to accountability? One of the philosophers in South Africa has put it very clearly, is that although the colonial master has left, but it still gets to tell the Global South what counts as genuine knowledge. And this knowledge and other epistemically good things are basically always touted as being rational, objective, and universal, and they are not tainted by the contingencies of place or time. And I think this is what really we need to look at if we are talking about a decolonizing discourse in global health knowledge production. So the epistemic level of decolonization requires a fundamental reorientation. And this would, first of all, mean repoliticizing the way we look at global health as a justice framework, which looks at histories and how they react with current isms like sexism, racism, neoliberal capitalism, and others that affect health equity. The other thing is to look at structural factors, and I think David flagged this, and also to reject the kind of funding which is vertically based on disease control programs. And finally, I think we really need to avoid looking only for global standards, only looking for knowledge that is quote unquote universally applicable, because what systems need to learn is always how they can deal within a specific context. And I think that gets erased when we talk of a global standard. So in this rejection of universalism, we are really countering the fact that the notion of the universal denies difference and diversity. And a human, which is this universal hegemonic conception of a subject, a human subject, is really a person who's shorn of all the specifics of identity, including race, color, caste, class, gender, and so on, which actually may be at the root of the discrimination, the deprivation, and the denial of a full health subjective experience. And so we have to look at a knowledge production process which is receptive to context, to epistemic diversity. And there are two ideas that the South African philosopher Veli Mitova has put out. One is the epistemic freedom, and the other is epistemic disobedience. And in both of them, we actually de-link the idea of a dislocated, disembodied knower from the process of knowledge production, and recall that we all have geohistorical locations and we are not disembodied or dislocated. So I would just like to close with complicating the conversation to take it a little beyond the sort of standard binary in decolonizing discourses, which is the global north and the global south. And I think we need to look at the fact that just having a geographical location is not the only marker of identity, because there are many other forms, intersecting forms of privilege and marginalization, which I've already mentioned, and institutional affiliations are not the only markers. So we have seen that local elites within the low and middle income countries actually do have privileged positions that are quite old before colonization, and they continue to benefit. They are the ones actually who access a lot of the global health training. And within India, we know that there are the Hindu Brahmins who actually dominate academic institutions and are notoriously casteist. So in the global context, why is this important for us when we talk about decolonizing global health knowledge production? And that is because across the globe, we see the rise of fascist movements. And these are actually nativist claims of far-right ethno-nationalists. And they promote othering of the minorities. And within India, we have found that the anti-colonial rhetoric is actually being used to promote indigenization, which emphasizes the superiority of certain castes and certain religions and certain genders. So when this indigenous term is claimed by a dominant majority, it actually erases the centuries-old struggles of those who are actually the Adivasis, the indigenous forest dwellers, who have been displaced and dispossessed for decades. Unfortunately, in the global north, in the academic fora, these voices that represent the ethno-nationalist movements are being accepted, are being promoted, and they are seen as authentic in terms of the decolonized voice, the indigenous voice, and ways of diversifying knowledge production. So here is a difficult call for all of us, is that the structurally privileged academics in the global north have to actually take a risk of exercising political judgment, of trying to understand the politics behind these claims of indigenization, and also have to therefore abandon paternalistic valorizations of authenticity. Hence my call to go beyond the binary in our seeking of the authentic voice of the global south. So thank you. I'd like to stop here, but I also want to draw your attention to the images that I have used so that we are not blind to what is happening in this world where the global institutions for governance have failed us completely in ensuring health or in ensuring that the international humanitarian standards that forbade the targeting of medical facilities have been upheld. We have failed in global governance at a massive scale, and I'd like all of us to remember this as I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jashodhara, also to keep it within time and to show indeed that this coloniality mindset is more pluriverse in itself, and that we can unpack it a little bit in the discussion afterwards. Desmond, over to you about this institution, not even institution, but a fora that is taking place nowadays in Davos, the World Economic Forum, and your assessment of it. You've written about it. We would like to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I won't be using slides. So, everyone's heard of the World Economic Forum, and especially of the annual meeting in Davos, which is taking place right now. But what exactly is the WEF? Where does it come from? What does it do? How does it exert its influence? And what is its message? So what is the WEF? It's been variously described as a private NGO, a think tank, and a private international organization. In 2015, it was formally recognized as an international organization enjoying NGO consultative status with ECOSOC, setting it on what it calls, quote, the next phase of its journey as the global platform for public-private cooperation, end quote. This lack of clarity regarding its organizational status raises questions as to its accountability. It is formally accountable only to its members, the 1,000 large firms that finance it through membership fees. But it seems that even they do not exercise control. It is the founder and executive chairman, Klaus Schwab, who still has effective power. So where does it come from? It started back in 1971 as a symposium organized by the Centre d'études industrielles in Geneva. The founder, Klaus Schwab, had studied business management in the US and even impressed by the so-called stakeholder approach. He wrote a book entitled Modern Enterprise Management in Mechanical Engineering, in which he argued that the management of a modern enterprise must, quote, serve not only shareholders, but all stakeholders to achieve long-term growth and prosperity, end quote. It gradually grew from a European to a worldwide enterprise. In Davos in 2000, following discussions with Kofi Annan the previous year, the WEF announced the Global Compact. This signaled a major shift in relations between the UN and the private sector to the benefit of the latter. Ironically, this coincided with the backlash against globalization. Demonstrations in 1999 against the G7 meeting in Cologne and the WTO ministerial in Seattle were followed by further protests against free trade in Davos in the year 2000. And so the WEF found it necessary to adapt to these new circumstances. One response was to expand its audience. It continued to be expensive and difficult to get into, but the meetings were opened up to others beyond business leaders. Another response was, as Klaus Schwab put it, that the WEF should now, quote, shift away from an event-oriented organization towards a knowledge and process-driven organization, end quote. This marked a transformation of WEF from merely convening to also acting as a think tank, promoting the role of the private sector in global governance. The 2008 global financial crisis seems not to have posed a challenge to the organization. The WEF said that it had been warning of a crisis for 2 years and then proposed a so-called Global Redesign Initiative, GRI, explicitly based on a concept of global governance in which the private sector would occupy a central place. It proposed an international system that is, quote, a wider, multifaceted system of global cooperation in which intergovernmental legal framework and institutions are embedded as a core, but not the sole and sometimes not the most crucial component, end quote. So what does it do? The Davos meeting is now supplemented by annual meetings in China and the United Arab Emirates and other regional meetings in other parts of the world. World leaders, including heads of UN organizations, find it hard to resist the invitation to attend these meetings. So this is where WEF exercises what one might call its convening power to include and to exclude. In addition, the WEF has created a very large number of different initiatives. For example, it hosts numerous platforms, each entitled Shaping the Future of Advanced Manufacturing and Production, Trade and Global Economic Dependence, Financial and Monetary Systems, Health and Healthcare, and many, many more. It also organizes numerous global future councils, over 30 in number, including biotechnology, agile governance, Japan, infrastructure, geopolitics, and so on. And it produces innumerable publications. Its flagships report are this annual Global Competitiveness Report and the Global Risk Report. In addition come the Global Information Technology Report, Annual Report, Weekly Newsletter, Annual Meeting Report, Regional Summary Report, and a large number of blogs and other material on the WEF webpage. So through all these activities and more, WEF exercises what might be called its discursive power. Within the health sector, more specifically, WEF has been directly involved in several activities. A number of global health initiatives have been announced in Davos, most notably perhaps Gavi in 2000. The WEF played a minor role in the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, convening a private sector consultation in late 2001 and launching the fund at the WEF annual meeting in 2002. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, CEPI, was formally launched at the 2017 meeting in Davos. Here, WEF's role is still more significant. It is listed, in fact, now it's listed as one of the founders on both the CEPI and the WHO websites. An even more recent initiative is COVAX. Here again, WEF was an important part of the story, since the initiative was first discussed at the Davos Forum by the head of the two PPPs, who met one night, according to one report, over scotch and nachos. All these are examples of what might be called WEF's entrepreneurial power. The organizational form of these global health PPPs has evolved somewhat over time. Gavi was a new type of organization, its board operating on the basis of what the World Bank refers to as an informal alliance based on, quote, a hybrid stakeholder corporate model. CEPI also adopted an unusual organizational form. It's been described as a hybrid institution, a global public-private partnership, and a multi-stakeholder coalition. Analyzing the case of the super PPP COVAX, Catterini and others, my colleagues, observed that its, quote, structural complexity obscures the vast differences between constituent partners, giving pharmaceutical corporations substantial power and making public representation, transparency, and accountability elusive, end quote. The same comment may equally be made of WEF itself, where accountability is indeed elusive. And this is a major problem. Which brings me to my final question about the WEF. What is its message? What is it seeking to achieve? As I noted, Schwab's original idea was to promote the power of stakeholders. This could be seen as an attempt to soften the brutality of a system driven by the private sector's self-interest by including workers and consumers in decision-making. But what WEF has in fact done is to both encourage and to benefit from a shift in global opinion towards the view that the private sector can and should play a major role in global governance. In practice, WEF has served to insert the private sector into the international policy-making arena, giving big business a position of influence in competition with established international organizations such as the WHO. A far cry, it would seem, from Schwab's original vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Desmond. So we see that we can keep global health researchers really in time, which means that we really have quite some time for debate and discussion, 45 minutes. I would like to ask if people here in the room or online, if they have a question, they can raise their hands. We can promote them also to speak out. If they type in the chat, we can read their questions. I will collect some questions first, and then we can come back to the audience. I have one for David to start with. David, listen well. Do you consider that we as a global health policy community should try to take more space and influence there within the UN system or within the World Economic Forum as the NGOs, academics and lesser powers present there seem to think? So should we capture space within the system? I think that's the question. Or should we rather ignore, reject that and create our own autonomous spaces to push boundaries? And what would that look like? So that's one question. Keep your thoughts there. I'm trying to see if there are other questions in the room. I see Kelly raising her hand. And Deborah. Kelly? and Katharini. So we take 4 questions and then we'll continue.
Is there a microphone?
Yeah, there's a microphone. And you need to speak in the microphone because otherwise the online audience cannot hear. Kelly.
What a fantastic set of presentations. Really, really thought-provoking and really important messages. So my question builds on yours, Remco. I've been following the World Economic Forum's annual meeting discussions as you were speaking because it was so relevant to what you were saying. And one of the things they're talking about today is about women's health and how it should be higher on the political agenda. New research from McKinsey Health Institute and the McKinsey Global Institute. This is exactly what you're describing. You know, that discursive power is being expressed to support investment in women's health. The way it's being framed is that we could at least add $1 trillion to the global economy if we improve women's health. And I guess, you know, the first reaction is, why do we commodify women's health in this way? But secondly, is this so bad because if it means increased investment in women's health? I think this is the dilemma, right? If it leads to action, is that a bad thing? So they're holding all the cookies. We are trying to get them to spend it in a better way. If they have to justify it by their own framing of the issue, is that so bad? I guess I would love to hear from the panelists whether that's something we can swallow or whether we actually challenge the fundamental framing of either it's women's health or other health issues in this way. Can we find a common ground, I guess?
Thank you for that. Deborah?
Thank you very much. I agree with Kelly. All of those presentations were really fantastic and worked really well together. I'm Deborah Gleeson from La Trobe University in Australia, and I've got a question for Desmond. I was really interested in those 3 types of power: convening power, discursive power, and entrepreneurial power, and wondered how much is that combination of those 3 particular types of power unique to the World Economic Forum, or does it map onto other global health institutions as well? Or do those other global health institutions perhaps have more direct forms of power as well to access? Thank you.
Clear? For this round, still Katharini?
Hi, thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations. And I just wanted to share that our colleague Christophe de Koster has shared a tweet, or retweeted a tweet from Seth Berkley, former CEO of CEPI, showing him and his good friend Dr. Richard Hatchett at the Hard Rock Hotel in Davos right now, where they started planning COVAX 4 years ago. They say we learned a lot of important lessons, but also with our partners successfully delivered 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines. And that takes me, I think, to this issue of the excessive emphasis on success in global health and the difficulty of speaking truth to power or even challenging these sorts of accounts. David, you said that one of the problems that we encounter as global health researchers is that we're increasingly dependent on powerful funding and actors in order to do our research, and that this leads to self-censorship and higher degrees of capture than we have seen previously. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can confront this dependency.
Okay, back to the panelists. Who would like to start? Jashodhara, shall I start with you?
Yes. Which question would you like me to respond to?
Maybe also on maternal, on women's health, and how you see that from the gender perspective you're working with.
Yes. So I have had some opportunity to look at the work of Gavi and the Global Fund in terms of how they handle gender, and that also brought up some of their internal governance and other mechanisms in the way they operate in the global health domain. And my sense is that a very instrumental framing of the issue in terms of an economic advantage and, trillion and so on and so forth, is for me a warning bell to really examine very closely where they are heading. Because sometimes these, the big numbers, the big amounts are also seen in the nature of investments that go into countries. But when you look physically at what changes, and especially from a gender and intersectional perspective, on the ground within countries, it's very, very difficult to make out the actual impact. A lot of it is actually smoke and mirrors. And as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of the resources are actually channeled back into host countries and host organizations through the quote unquote use of expertise. So I'm a little dubious, forgive me, because of what I've seen in Gavi and the Global Fund. I'm a little dubious about really what change on the ground this is going to make for women's health. And I suspect that it will look at very technocratic interventions that completely ignore, the socio-political and other dimensions and the structural determinants of women's health. So I'm skeptical, just to put it in brief. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, great. Dave, there were two questions asked to you by Els and by Katerini.
Sure. Let me begin with the one on Davos. And I mean, for all the reasons that Desmond kind of laid out, I personally would not invest time and effort in engaging in conversations at Davos. Rather, I think that forum should be delegitimized as opposed to being legitimized by civil society groups and others participating in that forum. And that really does speak to, the need to kind of reinvigorate the forums for conversation about policy and governance that are more properly democratically accountable and transparent. And somehow we've got to be able to convince the public and our politicians that that's an important thing that we have to work on. And this is really also about shifting power away from forums that private actors are able to influence towards forums where the public has a much better chance of influencing through democratic and transparent processes. And kind of touching on the $1 trillion or the investment that is being promoted around women's health and how this will potentially release $1 trillion US. I mean, how on earth was that figure calculated? But the whole question about investment, public or private investment, there's no, in my mind, Ron is absolutely right, as he did in the earlier session, to highlight the fundamental imbalance between private wealth and public wealth, and that we've got to get that shift better than it is currently. It's not to say that there should be no private finance or no private investment, but right now the imbalance is dangerous and destructive and harmful. And one of the ways in which we get that balance is through fixing the tax system. This has been on the agenda. This has been called for by civil society actors for years and years now. We've been well aware of the vast amounts of money that both poor and rich countries lose through tax avoidance and tax abuse. But we have to fix that tax system, the broken tax system. What the OECD is proposing doesn't go far enough. But there are sensible and obvious policies that have been recommended that are technically feasible. And this is the important point that we need to hammer home, that there are policy options that are technically feasible that we should be campaigning for. And we should not just be leaving it to the tax justice community to campaign for. Everyone in global health should be campaigning for these policy changes to be implemented. And this not just about tax policy, this is about the entire system by which we manage money in the world, including the banking and accountancy system. That all needs to be reformed. And just finally coming back to Katerini's question, tax is also about generating the public revenue that can support public interest research so that we become less dependent on commercial funding for research. I think it also requires all academics to resist the way in which universities and individuals are being performance managed. So increasingly, we see performance management in ways that will reward people who have been able to bring in commercial or corporate funding, and actually punish people who have been doing certain kinds of research that may be more social and political in its orientation. So universities and the higher education sector also needs to kind of resist some of the ways in which the metrics in higher education are being designed and developed. So let me leave it at that. Thanks.
Very clear. Desmond.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll respond to Kelly and Deborah. Thank you for your questions. Kelly, yes, sort of, as I take it, do we reject the argument if we like the recommendation? In a sense, it's a sort of tricky position. And I'd relate this to the wider discourse, the dangers of that discourse. I mean, part of it, what manifestation is the whole debate about everything is capital. So the environment is natural capital. Human beings are human capital. Social relations are social capital. It's a way of thinking that has been is very influential, and in many ways I think dangerous. And sort of related to that is what I called quasi-market thinking. So how do we address the challenge of the environment? Well, we put a price on it, and if it hasn't got an explicit market price, we estimate. So there's a way of thinking which is very powerful, and the problem is, as you say, sometimes it takes you in a direction, to a conclusion which you think is great. But I think it's dangerous, and I think it should be resisted. I say why? Well, in a sense, one level you can't be sure where it will take you specifically in relation to a sort of specific issue, but also more generally, it takes you. How should I say? It's even more dangerous in a more general sense, because this quasi-market way of thinking can be, and not just can be, it is enormously dominant. So I think one has to be extremely careful. Ideally, one can like the recommendation and yet argue against that way of arguing for it. Turning to Deborah's, very interesting. Other institutions and the very types of power. I mean, in relation to the World Economic Forum itself, I would say that sort of, well, relative to other institutions, it's the convening power is the most notable. And that is pretty indisputable, really. The power of the forum to exclude and include. People will go to Davos, where they can't be bothered to go to a load of other international organization meetings. I think after that, I would put discourse of power second, and entrepreneurial power third, because entrepreneurial power is relatively more recent, and at least compared to other institutions, perhaps not so powerful. And sort of to make that point, I was thinking, well, what about a comparison with the World Bank, for example, where the order would be rather different. I mean, the World Bank has a very powerful entrepreneurial power. It has a huge amount of money and investment, and it can do things very directly in a way that the WF doesn't and can't. But the World Bank also, in second place, I would say discursive power, because the power of the World Bank to promote precisely the sort of discourse I've just been discussing is very significant. So, and I think convening power, and okay, certainly the World Bank has convening power as well, but in relative terms, I think I'd say, so in a sense you have the reverse order in a way. Both of them draw on all three forms of power, but in different ways and to different extents.
Okay. That's very clear. We have some questions online, but I saw also a question here in the audience from Ole Peter. Maybe we can start with that one.
Yeah, a very good series of interventions, so thank you very much. One question, specific question to Jashodhara. By the way, it's excellent to see you here, and I'm happy to reconnect. And you will be part of the new commission, obviously. So one question that comes to my mind when you're talking about beyond the binary, of course, in any commission on global health, the decolonization lens must be applied somehow. But what you're saying, obviously, and I think that everybody would join you in saying that we must go beyond that lens. And you say, for example, that privileged positions predate, the colonization process that we have been through. So, what would this mean in practice? How should one apply with due care the decolonization lens in the new commission or in any commission on power asymmetries when it comes to global health?
Thank you for that. Let me read out 3 questions asked by people online. First, from Christoph de Koster. How would panelists assess Tedros' track record in speaking truth about power? He seems to play the game vis-à-vis other public-private partnerships, etc., but also has spoken truth during the pandemic vis-à-vis access to medicines, right to health, right to vaccines and intellectual property, etc., and in other occasions like in Gaza now. So it's about the role of the WHO in its leadership vis-à-vis what we've been hearing earlier. From Stephanie Top, where do you see the relative responsibility and power of researchers like ourselves versus free press and traditional institutions of governance for launching such challenges and recreating such spaces? So it's about the autonomy of the global health policy research landscape and where we can start to build. Abhijit Das asks, why is the rise of private sector and ethno-nationalism influence not challenged by the international system? And if such, why isn't there more accountability mechanisms vis-à-vis the rise of ethno-nationalism? I hope these questions are clear. I'm looking at the around. I think we should start with these and then we can continue. Jashodhara, can you start again?
Thank you, Ole Petter, for your question. And I think the point that I was trying to make is that often when we want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was the first box we tend to tick when we want to move into decolonization, we look for faces and voices from the global south. And sometimes we do have people who are already in the global north, who have been trained in the global north, and who actually speak the language that is understandable and comforting to the others in the global north. And so we tend to bring in those voices. Even when we go into countries, for example, if you look at me, I am a person from the upper class. I have an elite background. I'm from an upper caste. So I speak for a particular demographic in my country. But I am in the commission, and I feel that we need to do a little more work. I'm not resigning from the commission, but I'm saying we need to work a little harder to understand some of the politics, including as when we also look at research products. So we've also had scholars kind of valorizing, nativist positions and nativist claims and talking about certain kinds of knowledge that they want to be privileged in the global health knowledge production domain. And I think we have to be careful to understand some of the background politics and to take a critical political judgment in how we incorporate, for instance, these knowledge products into the body of new knowledge that we are trying to generate. So in practical terms, I just think it means being more conscious of, the socio-political, trends within other countries, and to make sure that we are not just privileging the already privileged voices. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dave.
Thanks, Remco. Yeah, I don't know about commenting on Tedros's track record. I think the more important point is, WHO is an institution that is not being allowed to function in the way that it needs to function or should function. So there are a whole bunch of financial and financing and structural problems with WHO that constrain its ability to fulfill its mandate and its mission. And whoever is in that position is stuck with those constraints. And so we do need to continue to strengthen and support WHO to be able to be the kind of institution it was set up to be. And as far as Stephanie's question about the relative roles of the press, I don't know if we have much of a free and independent public interest press in many parts of the world. Relative role of the press, universities, and I think it was UN agencies or international organizations. I think it's good to have a pluralistic system of research and evidence generation. So I'm not quite sure how to kind of titrate the relative degree of responsibility and activity across those three sectors, but pluralism is a good thing. And I think beyond that pluralism, this notion of public interest functions, public interest values, that to me is really important. It goes back, I think, to what Desmond was saying about the mindset, the language, the narrative that has seeped into, you know, the air that we breathe now. You know, we are all thinking in market terms, and we're all thinking in competitive terms. So restoring a narrative about the public interest or the common interest is important. What else was that?
I think it is also about how can we reclaim space? How can we reclaim space as global health policy researchers? How to create that?
Yeah, I mean, I think reclaiming spaces it's partly about, you know, resisting that self-censorship I talked about earlier. You reclaim that space. It's something that you do as opposed to waiting for someone to give you permission to do. I think we in academia, perhaps people also working in the NGO sector and in the intergovernmental sector and in governments also need to be building bridges across these different sectors and creating informal alliances, once again, in defense of or in support of the public interest or the common interest. So we do need to be creating opportunities for people to create more democratic spaces by which we can accrue power in order then to be able to influence policy in the way that governance works. But there are no easy solutions to this. There are no quick fixes. A lot of this is about organizing and building from the bottom up.
Let me take it from here and also ask Desmond. There was a question about ethno-nationalism, and I would like to link it to the World Economic Forum, in the sense that one thing that became clear during the pandemic was this notion of conspiracy theory that is taken forward by the ethno-nationalists and the populists and the far right at the moment. The World Economic Forum, it's the cosmopolitans, they are taking over, it's the elite, it's dominated by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and that narrative was often used to focus on this. We need to protect our identities and who we are. We need to take back control. Can you reflect about that? How that relates to the power developments that you described? It's about discourse. It's about the discourse of. So there's also an anti-discourse perceived about the World Economic Forum by the public.
I'm not quite with you on the anti-discourse. Is this the sort of
that the World Economic Forum is taking over? We need to take back control as people.
Yes.
How would you reflect on that from your research?
It's not, well, in a sense, it's absent. Whether that put it. I mean, in the sense that there is not a counter force. I think it's a sense of frustration and so on, which is to some extent being expressed here. But there isn't a counter discourse, I don't think, to this dominant market private sector discourse. And there's a certain huge sense of sort of frustration, but I don't know that there's an effective counter discourse.
Maybe also to, I don't know if the audience can fill in here, but that's at least with the far-right parties in the Netherlands and other European countries, they say that the World Economic Forum is, that's the problem. They are dominating, they're taking over.
Yes, I see what you say. I'm sorry. Yes, right. So there's two very different forms of critique. I mean, there's sort of one I'm coming up with, and one which is totally different. Now, that's a very good point, which may, for better or worse, be much more effective than ours, given how powerful these sort of ethno-nationalist thought. Now, that is a frightening point. Yes, yes. Could I respond to Stephanie's question also? Because I think it's quite interesting, because we did, I look at Stephanie because not here, because we did, of course, discuss the role of the researcher, and the idea is that you want to go beyond just producing academic articles, and then one justifies oneself, well, we're going to feed those into debates, which other people would pick up and so on. But and maybe we can write blogs and stuff, or we can feed journalists. But I think the role of journalists is quite interesting. And in our research group, we've actually had a couple of sessions of trying to learn, talk to and learn from investigative journalists. And I think this is something more researchers can do, in fact, more in terms of when we're interested in trying to achieve some sort of change, because they have skills and they have knowledge and experience which we can learn from. And it was very interesting to talk to them about, the methods they use, freedom of information, but lots of other things which we either hadn't thought of or don't think we have access to. So I think the opportunity is not just to feed journalists, as it were, but also to work together with journalists to get at the sort of information some of which is extraordinarily difficult, especially in the private sector.
All right. We still have time, which is good. There are some questions online, at least one, but I also see a question in the room from Ronald.
It was more a response. Is it? Oh, there we go. It's more a response, Remco, to the invitation about sort of commenting back about this kind of counter WEF kind of grouping that began to occur. I mean, our very strange president now in Argentina at the World Economic Forum basically sort of made the announcement that he sort of said, well, it's all you socialists out here at the World Economic Forum, you're the problem. So, I mean, the World Economic Forum people who represent the totally non-socialist elites of the world are now being called socialist. This is part of this kind of a discourse of the very far-right, autocratic, libertarian. And that's a movement that's been building ever since, especially accelerated during the lockdown periods of COVID. So I see that as being sort of part of that sort of same particular political arc, where the established liberal democratic system has largely failed to actually accommodate a lot of the transitions and growing insecurities that many people in the world are feeling, especially kind of in higher and upper middle income countries, which is tilting towards that kind of tribal nationalism, which, as I say, is being manipulated not so much by progressive kind of social democratic parties, but by autocratic right parties. And so in that sense, the World Economic Forum still represents the same object that needs to be defeated. Much like it's the World Economic Forum would love to be defeated, I suppose, by people like Trump. So it's part of that political narrative that is happening right now, which is really, I think, one of the more frightening ones that we're going to have to be grappling with in the coming months, if not just in the coming years.
Sakiko behind you has a question or remark.
It's a two-hander to follow up on Ron's comment, because I mean, this is a confusing landscape of who's saying what and who's against whom and so forth. But my observation, I haven't studied this, my observation is that the extreme right whatever they say is in league with the corporate elites, and the philanthropists and so forth. I mean, you know, they may, I mean, Modi, I mean, in India, isn't the BJP and Modi and so forth very much in line, in league with corporate elites? Maybe not all of them, but definitely there is an alliance there. Trump has done everything he could to reduce taxes on corporations and on the elites. So I don't see the opposition between the right-wing extremist ethno-nationalist movements and the unaccountable, extremely powerful private actors.
I see Felix and another colleague has a hand, and then we still have 2 questions from people online, and I think then we can also perhaps wrap it up with the panel. Yes,
yeah,
Felix.
Quick remark and then a question. The remark is on the idea of investing in women to up GDP. We once looked into how the World Bank thought about human capital in the sphere of health, and if you want to trust these numbers, in the case of the World Bank, they assumed that you know, for X amount investment, you reduce mortality by a certain percentage, which leads to more GDP growth. That was one factor. And the second factor was by X amount of investment, you reduce stunting by X amount, and that must have an effect on GDP growth because how tall people are is related to how much they earn. And those 2 were weighed against each other, put together in the Human Capital Index to measure, you know, the effects of wealth investment. So if you want to trust these numbers, that's up, you know, it's up to every individual. But if you look into the nitty-gritty, it gets pretty difficult. And then, as to the effects of this logic, if you subsume health investments to GDP growth, you of course exclude people who are retired, people who are disabled, people who are unwilling to work, and people who earn very little, because your money has to go to where the high income earner is. That's just one of the advantages. And then I had a question, the disadvantages, and one question I had to Desmond is, do you consider Klaus Schwab a tragic figure? Because he tried to reduce the power of corporations with the stakeholder approach, and he is achieving the opposite.
One question from a colleague in the back.
Hi, thanks. I think a lot of the questions and discussions are also a lot at a macro level, at a large, zoomed out macro level. I wonder if this also is space for everydayness of things, you know, so when we're talking about political determinants of health or accountability, there's also this everydayness of things they unfold. You know, somehow I think maybe it misses out the discourse. It's just kind of quite lost in the very macro, zoomed out view from the north, you know, because this zoomed out macro view is not what everyday life is. It's very different. So somehow I think also maybe that is how, like I think someone said that you start to learn and to speak the language, which is heard and which you want to hear, is it somehow doesn't talk about the person who is affected with this political determinants or accountability issues. I think it's also important to bring in those narratives into the conversation. Yeah. So I think that part is missing from this discussion. How do we bring that back? Because otherwise this whole discourse on global health becomes too distant for anyone in the South to even relate to far wide there. And also, I think, Sakiko, your question about Modi, but I think who created Modi? I mean, if you look at what I think Arundhati Roy's question, is it not the North which is so responsible for how Modi has turned out to be? Is it not just so much of excessive pampering by all
Thank
the
you
big
for
actors?
This also speaks about methodological and theoretically bringing the dailiness and the global governance, the multilateral transnational sphere together, and how to do that. I think this is so very important also for the Commission to elaborate on this. I have some questions. I think the panelists can also read them. We give you 3 minutes each somehow to wrap it up. But just the last question from the audience. Christophe de Koster asked about any thoughts on the World Health Summit vis-à-vis the World Economic Forum, or for those who might have been active within that space. And then Marriott from Oxfam asked also about the World Health Summit is attempting to be health specific World Economic Forum type. Do you think those of us concerned about asymmetries of power in global health governance could use this moment to launch an Oxfam style of inequality report, inequality in global health report being launched at the World Health Summit? This is an interesting idea. Thank you, Anna. Else, Terrell asked, following up on David's comment on the vast difference between public and private wealth, is it not just in quantity but also in quality because of the different way public versus finances and accounting work? You mentioned tackling the banking and accountancy systems. Can you elaborate on that? Point to research on what we can build and contribute to. And then I still have a question from Willem van der Put, a colleague at the Institute of Tropical Medicine. One of the things happening quietly also is to counter the power of blocking financing of local organizations. So a lot of local civil society is being blocked from finance at the moment in the often false name of terrorism, and terrorism being financed. Can you talk about this also perhaps in the Indian and other contexts? I think we'll leave it by that, and we'll give the audience, the panelists, the time to respond and to have a last final word. David?
Thanks, Remco, and I'll be very brief. Just a little bit about the comments that were made about the rise of ethno-nationalism and authoritarian populism, which we're seeing across the world. I read Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, over Christmas, and I found it a very, very useful explanation of this phenomenon. And it really helped me to kind of better understand how it is that we're seeing this rapid rise in ethno-nationalism and a rejection of science and a rejection of all forms of governance. And I think it comes back to this point about how we try and reform the system, and whether we take the conservative low-hanging fruit route or we adopt a more radical and transformative agenda. Because my fear is that we continue down the low-hanging fruit route. We leave the space open for the kinds of authoritarian populism that has emerged over the last few years. And it may even be too late to reclaim that space. On the issue of quantity and quality of public and private financing for research, there is good private research. There is also very bad, inefficient, wasteful private research, and the same can be said about publicly financed research as well. So I don't know if it's a simple dichotomy, public-private here. Just a final word about local civil society being squeezed out. Yeah, you're right. Local civil society organizations are finding it harder to raise funding for their organizations. But this is not just in terms of being able to raise private finance. We're also seeing this as a feature of philanthropy. So, one of the big trends of philanthropy over the last 10 years has been to fund smaller and smaller number of organizations with bigger and bigger grants. And that, again, has been part of the loss of plurality, but also this way in which civil society has been, it's much easier to control and manage civil society in this manner. So, again, a connection between the empowerment of civil society actors and the way in which philanthropy has evolved over the last couple of decades. So I'll end there and say once again, thank you to the organizers for this session, and great to see all of you on the screen.
Thank you, Dave, for that. Jashodhara?
Thank you, Remco, and thank you, Dave, for your comments. I would just like to begin by talking about the space for civil society organizations and movements. I think in India, we're seeing not only a kind of a restriction of access to funding for NGOs, but also for think tanks and policy research groups that are not necessarily towing the line of the current regime. Their access to funding has been denied, and many of them are looking at shutdown. The other point I'd like to just flag here is that when we talk about global governance and political determinants, we are also assuming a backdrop of a kind of international system of mutual accountability and certain international norms and standards and values that everyone commits to uphold. What I think we are seeing today, and I speak in a very, very contemporary sense, as well as the last few years, is increasing contempt for some of the liberal values that underpin this international understanding. And I think this is something that should worry us, because once that is gone, then it's a free-for-all. And some of the challenges that populist regimes and populist campaigns have been throwing up for anything which is organized around some idea or intellectual concept, it actually is a kind of anti-intellectual movement and campaign that will gradually erode anything you try and establish as fact. And now in India, we have a word called post-fact, because even if there are research, large research surveys conducted, their data is now kind of shoved under the carpet, and what is put out is completely different. And it's called post-fact because it has no relation with reality. I feel that we need to think of more transformative strategies. I agree with Dave that the time for diplomacy and civility again is associated with the colonial project of civilizing. I think the time for diplomacy and civility is actually past, and we need to think of more radical ways of getting our ideas out and mobilizing more thinking around some of these concepts of global governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jashodhara, also for being with us. Desmond.
Thank you. Yes, the point you made, it seems to raise the question of whether the issues that we take up are sort of too far removed from people in the South, and that is certainly a concern. But the problem is, things like TRIPS and international property, all these sort of things, which seem very remote. And the problem is precisely that they are remote in a sense. But how can one both demonstrate how important they are, and hopefully demonstrate what can be done about them, and what can be done about them certainly is not going to happen at grassroots level. I think there is a problem in terms of the distance between the macro complex issues that we're trying to analyze and the reality of how that plays out on the ground. Finally, Liz, is Klaus Schwab a tragic figure? It's a wonderful question, and I wish I knew the answer. I don't think that, one could perhaps demonstrate sort of empirically how this idea got distorted. I've done work on that myself in other ideas. Whether he's tragic, I suppose, depends on how he feels about it. I mean, I'm sure he's totally pleased to have been 50 years in charge of an enormously influential and important organization. Whether he goes to bed thinking, shit, I doubt. But I wish I knew, but in order to find out, I'd have to somehow get close to him, or even get close inside his head, and that's not an easy task. But it's a very good question. I'm not sorry for him, let's say that.
Yes, let us slowly end here. Also to Anna Mariet on the World Health Summit. Yes, indeed, the Global Health and Equality Report might be a good idea, so that's something we can think of. The discussion will move on later after the lunch. I'm looking to Katharini to say something about it. Give a warm applause to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remco, and thank you also to Dave and Jashodhara and Desmond for excellent presentations and for good questions from the audience. It's not on? Okay, we're going to take a break for lunch now, and we are going to be back at 14:15, 2:15 Central European Time for those online. And in that session, we will be discussing the political economy of health post-COVID. The session will be chaired by Sakiko Fukuda-Par with presentations from Ron Labonte and Remco, and from Ted Schrecker, who's joining us online, as well as James Pfeiffer, who's joining us from the University of Washington remotely. So see you back online and in the room in an hour and 15 minutes, and thank you very much for your participation.